Okay. Okay. Right. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining another wonderful event of Salt Lake Interfaith Roundtable. We are so excited to hear and learn new things from our distinguished speakers. Before we start, I wanna give a few minutes our dear friend Linda Brewer to give opening prayer for us. Please, Linda, go ahead.
Thanks, Zainab. Okay, let's just enter into that sacred space in which we each dwell. And just how grateful I am for this time together, for this interfaith roundtable that brings us together in mutual respect, in love and harmony, in peace and in joy, where we can come together and learn about the faith of each other and to recognize the commonality of each of our spiritualities. I'm so grateful for our speakers today, for this opportunity to expand our awareness of what is already happening in our universe. And so I'm just grateful for each person. I know that the meeting goes smoothly, that all the technical difficulties are overcome, and that we each have open hearts and open minds to learn and grow together on this day. And I pray these things in all the names by which God is known. Amen.
Thank you so much, Linda. This was beautiful. And today's host is Catholic Diocese of Salt Lake City, and we have very distinguished two wonderful women who will be speaking about science and faith to us. And I want to give the floor to Susan to introduce our speakers, Julia Boerio-Goates and Heather Peterson-Schaefer to us. And I'm so excited to hear today's lecture. Thank you so much, Susan, for putting this event together, and I can't wait to hear.
Thank you, Zainab. We are very excited to be able to host this today, and I would like to introduce very briefly our two speakers. Heather Peterson-Schaefer is currently a member of our lay ecclesial ministry formation program in her third year of studies. But in her career, she is a rocket scientist, an engineer with lots of interesting experiences. And we are also graced to have Dr. Juliana Boerio-Goates, who is a certified lay ecclesial minister with a lot of ministry experience in the Diocese of Salt Lake City. She is a professor emerita of Brigham Young University in chemistry, and very well known as our past president of the Diocesan Pastoral Council. So Heather will be first, and we welcome her, and I hope you enjoy it.
Let me share the screen here.
Oh, sorry. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Is that visible?
Yeah, absolutely. See ya.
All right. Okay. I didn't really know what you were looking for in this, so I'm just going to speak from my experience. Obviously, as a scientist, I've run into this, and as a cradle Catholic, I've run into this issue quite a bit.
Hey, Heather, we can see your email, not the presentation.
Okay. Let's see here. Full screen. Does that help or?
No, we still see your email.
Okay, all right.
You might click on the button that says view file.
How's that? Oh, it's not on yours. There, that should be it.
Yes,
Yes.
there it comes.
Okay. All right, apologies. So science and religion in the 21st century and why it matters. As a scientist, an engineer, and a cradle Catholic, I've run into this issue quite a bit. Just a little of my background. I have a bachelor's in chemistry from Maryville College in East Tennessee. We've already talked a bit about IU, but that is where I got my first master's degree in organic and a second master's degree in material science and engineering. So I'm not only bilingual, but geographically diverse. And I'll talk about a little bit about where I have lived. And earlier in the conversation, I think we've mentioned upstate New York, Alaska, and IU. So you'll all be familiar with these areas and hopefully the attitudes that I encountered in them on this subject. And people say you're from New York City? No. Like our other guest, and I can't find her name at this time, I'm from just outside of the Capital District area. So Troy, New York, actually. And this is actually a picture of the church I attended as a child. I went to Catholic school, and inevitably the question came up, so who do we believe, our science teacher or our religion teacher? And it was asked of our religion teacher. She was a religious sister of the, Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet. This isn't their habit. It's more of a penguin suit than the one in the picture, but that's as close as I could come. But it was asked, which do we believe? And Sister Karen responded that Genesis is a nice story, but you're learning something different, a different kind of truth in science class, and that both should be respected and both have their place in your education. And I finished out, graduated, quote unquote, from 8th grade, and suddenly my family decided to move to Florida, which was a bit of a culture shock. Florida is, in my opinion, fairly overdeveloped, and a lot of too many people for my comfort. And I think it was my confirmation class. So I think a few weeks after we had moved down there and I was going through all of this turbulence in my life, someone asked the sister in charge of our confirmation class, so which is it, Genesis or evolution or science class? And her response was, well, I think Genesis is a nicer story. And that really troubled me. And I couldn't quite put it together until maybe later in life. The idea that it was easier to read 30 pages of Genesis and say, that's all I need to know on the subject, was a little frightening to me, because I was investing a lot of time in this education stuff. What's going on here? So as soon as I possibly could, I graduated from high school and escaped to East Tennessee, which was yet another bit of culture shock. Maryville College is a small Presbyterian college right in the Appalachian Mountains, and very much affected by the history of Tennessee, where I think we're mostly familiar with the Scopes monkey trial, roughly 1925, put a science teacher on trial for teaching evolution in the public schools. And whatever the actual outcome of the trial, it put a freeze on the teaching of evolution throughout the state, all the way up to the institution where I was studying. And I recall a
biology professor telling us he wasn't going to teach evolution. He was going to teach two types of evolution. One was a John Baptist type, preparing the way for one who would come after. So different species preparing the soil and the conditions for the next species to take over in a field, as opposed to the from the beginning creation out of chaos evolution that seemed to offend most people there. So that was a bit, studying chemistry under those conditions. My PChem professor surreptitiously handed us a timeline of the Big Bang Theory and said, don't tell anyone, but here's what's really going on. And it's not that I didn't get a good education, and it's not that the professors were any adept at their subjects. It was just this atmosphere of fear of what the general public would think of them, and try to control what they were teaching if it got out. So about my third year, I'd had enough of this, went to Nevada, University of Nevada, Reno, for a 10-week internship. And so it was just 10 weeks of science and nature, and I was good with that. And I also learned that you can have high heat with low humidity in the high dry desert. I fell in love with that. I was so done with Florida and its humidity, and Tennessee. And so I came back, finished up, got my degree, went on to grad school, Indiana University. Where most of us who've gone to grad school, you're dealing with a different group of people. The school is large enough, I think it said 55,000 students, that it's pretty insulated from the local culture. So there were no obvious conflicts, but I did recall, as I was putting this together, that there was an article in around 1995 when I was in the process of moving to Indiana, that they had found all of this paraphernalia from the KKK. But it wasn't, and what they kept stressing is it's not the racist KKK of the South. It was the anti-Catholic KKK of the Midwest. I thought,
it's a lot better.
I'm in for it. But I did find a nice church community. This is St. Charles Borromeo. It's right off the campus, beautiful stone church. And made it through the 2 years, got my degree. And my apologies to the individual who really likes Bloomington. I decided to leave. And I was really fortunate. Shortly after I finished grad school, got a nice job offer from Morton Thiokol. I'm probably familiar with them as the manufacturer of the solid rocket boosters for the shuttle. So my professional life began as a rocket scientist. But once again, I came out here into the middle of this kind of push and pull of the science versus religion. There were stories when they brought the first group of scientists and engineers out to build the first stage of the Minuteman land-based nuclear deterrent. They encountered a lot of friction in that area. The story was told of one PhD's child coming home from school with information about Noah's Ark and the flood pertaining to science class. And so he flew into a self-righteous rage and went down and taught evolution to the class himself. So things like that. And we're just gonna scroll down. In the middle of all of this, changing careers and so forth, I decided to visit Alaska, which was another interesting encounter along these terms. My one piece of advice is never start a marriage in Alaska. It lasted 8 months. long enough for me to change my name, and I I got out of there as soon as I could. But what was interesting about Alaska was I ran into some of the similar, I want to say, anti-intellectualism that I had encountered in Florida. This idea that we're not smart enough to understand what you're telling us, so stop trying to tell us anything. And I was talking to a woman who owned her own business, repaired aircraft for a living, had enough letters after her, more letters after her name than I did. But the minute I started asking questions about some paint that we were working with on the chemistry level, she said, stop, don't ask, don't talk about chemistry. I don't want to feel stupid. I thought, wow, that was just kind of an eye-opening moment. And I started putting some of what I'm talking about today together. And so I started thinking about, what is the source of this conflict? In school, I was always taught, it goes back to Galileo. It's all the church's fault. Pope Urban stepped in where he shouldn't have, and we have this not made up, but this false dichotomy of religion versus science. And the question's been asked, if Pope Urban had not entered into the conversation and forced his advisors who were opposed to Galileo's theories to discuss those theories directly with Galileo, wouldn't we have improved upon the Copernican model faster than we actually did? Because the Copernican model wasn't perfect. They couldn't explain what the stars were. They just kind of put them in this outer orb of light. They had no concept that those pinpricks of light off in the distance were the same as the sun at the center of our universe. We hadn't figured that out. And by the Pope intervening, he stopped that conversation. He stopped them from meeting head on and maybe working some of these questions out. And with obviously the Darwin versus Genesis, Darwin didn't explain how life began. He was observing changes in nature that he could trace back to differences in habitat, the different styles of beaks on the finches. And it grew into a bigger theory of, well, how did we get here? But that's not really the source of our that shouldn't pit religion against science. And yet in so many people's minds, it does. When in fact, science and religion have collaborated quite well, particularly in the last century. Science has given us the means to kill on a large scale. And in a lot of cases, unfortunately, religion has been behind that motivation. Rwanda, the Holocaust, development of nuclear weapons. So how do we as scientists better communicate with the rest of the world? I've seen some, what I call mini 101 lectures on basic research, such as carbon dating. And they're good, they're informative, but they're pretty much like a freshman series lecture. And I, for the life of me, having watched the whole lecture, couldn't come back and give you a good reason why carbon dating works, except that we've done a lot of research, we've compared it to things that we know. And yes, it invariably predicts roughly the correct age of an item. Another way is to increase basic science education, but how does that mesh up with people who simply shut down when you start talking about anything technical to them? How do we get around that? How do we convince people they're intelligent enough to learn these things, at least to a point to understand them successfully. We've had public debates with clergy, but again, that's a specialized, one person with a specialized education talking to someone else with a very specialized education. And when they can come to commonality, it's great, but where does that leave the general public? They still aren't getting it. And then most recently, we've had to deal with how do you talk to someone who holds an opinion that has no basis in reality? I like this meme, the question everything, including your conspiracy theory. That cuts some conversations short. So at this point, why do we care? Why does it matter? Well, COVID's a good example of why we should care. We started getting sick, depending on how you look at it, sometime around December, January. This new disease shows up in Wuhan, China, roughly December. And we have a picture of the culprit almost immediately, within months. Great technology, SEM, different, great photomicrograph of what we're dealing with. Further, within another 6 to 8 months, we have not one, but 3 solutions, 3 vaccinations. And yet here we are, 20 months later, we're still trying to convince enough people to be vaccinated to protect the entire population, including those who aren't eligible for vaccines. So my question is, where has religion been in all of this? Science, that's a miracle, what I just described, by most standards. I mean, polio was 5 years, and we never did. It wasn't until the 90s we figured out what the pathogen in polio was. But we're not hearing from our religious leaders. This whole crisis has been about taking care of your neighbor. The masks don't protect the individual. The masks protect everyone else from what we might have. The vaccines, while they protect the individual to some extent, work even better if the more of us who are vaccinated. So I'm arguing that this entire crisis is about helping our neighbor. And it's not being able to communicate that to the general public has really harmed our recovery here. So what is behind this hesitancy? Why are people refusing to see this for the miracle that it is? Why don't we trust our public health people? And I've seen some articles, I've seen a lot of articles printed on this, trying to understand, one, trying to figure out how to change people's minds, and 2, trying to understand where it's coming from. Excuse me. And it comes down to, as human beings, we want an unchanging view. We want certainty of who we are, where we are in the universe, and what's coming next. And science has continually changed that, set the waters in motion. But religion should. Religion shouldn't be giving people a comforting place to rest. Religion should be challenging us. All faiths have some form of the golden rule. It's not about the individual, it's about the community. So why have we not, as a religious community, stepped forward and convince these people that we need to help each other? And this article that I've referenced at the bottom talks about when asked a question where only one can be right, religion or science, or where religion and science come in conflict, which would you go to? And the survey says something like 58% said they would go with the religious answer. 33% said they would go with the science answer. 6% said it would depend. So think about that. 91% of the people who responded to the survey gave a knee-jerk answer. 6% actually thought about it and said, yeah, this depends what the question is. What are the facts? And I'm guessing about 3% hung up on the survey question. So anyway, those are my thoughts. I welcome your questions. I wish I had a sweeping answer that says we should go out and do this, but I've been wrestling with it for most of my life, and I have yet to come up with a coherent solution. But I know it involves both my faith and my education as a scientist and engineer. Thank you.
You're on mute, Julie.
Okay. Heather, is it okay if I stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, let me stop. Yeah, found it.
Okay.
All yours.
All righty.
Thank you, Heather.
Is that visible to everybody?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
great.
I'm going to minimize the gallery if I can, so it doesn't interfere with the recording, blocking some of the things that are on my screen. Well, thank you for this invitation to participate today. As I'll mention in a minute, I enjoy doing these things. I want to thank Heather for her presentation. She did a great job of doing some background things for me that I'm going to build on. And specifically, excuse me, she ended her presentation with this observation that science continually challenges us to rethink our place in the universe, and so should religion. And that is a perspective that I share very deeply, and I'm going to return to it several times during my presentation. Okay. Well, a few weeks ago, I was at the ophthalmologist. I'm a candidate for cataract surgery. So the idea of lenses and getting my eyes to see properly has been weighing on my mind. And so it struck me as I was sitting there with my eyes dilated, waiting for the doctor to come in, that this image of lenses and using the appropriate lenses to view different aspects seemed to me to be an apt description of how I think about the dimensions of my Catholic faith, and coupled with my training in primarily the physical sciences, but I have done some teaching in the biological sciences, so I have a little bit of background in that area. I am always grateful to Susan Northway when she invites me to do something. I guess I am ultimately, one way or another, a teacher, and so the teacher in me enjoys the learning process that goes into speaking about something new. And some of you may remember 5 or 6 years ago, I gave a presentation to this group on Pope Francis's encyclical on care for creation, Laudato Si. And so I have a sense of the diversity of faiths that are represented in this Zoom session, in this Interfaith Roundtable. But I have to admit that I knew very little about what positions your respective faith traditions might teach about the sources and the role of revelation, and especially how revelation deals with your understanding of creation. And so I spent a little bit of time trying to come to some understanding about that. And with what little I have learned, I don't want to presume to tell you what your traditions teach, but to offer perhaps just a little general statement, which is not all faiths have conflicts between science and faith. And whether they do, in my cursory study, seem to depend upon the nature and the role of the divine in creation as taught by a particular faith tradition. Well, learning that was something of a surprise to me, to realize the extent to which faith-science conflicts are kind of localized in Western Christian traditions. Was a surprise to me. It probably shouldn't have been, but it was. And so what it reminded me is that in a gentle way, that the lenses through which we view the world frequently offer us a perspective, but for those who view the world differently through different lenses, it may have a very different perspective. And so when I first logged in this afternoon, I had a chance to talk to James about his perspectives in terms of the indigenous populations. And so that's a good example for me of what I mean. But what it does mean is that I feel that I should explain to you a little bit about what it means to look through a Catholic lens, or at least the Catholic lenses that have been ground through for me through my education. So let me switch here. First of all, Catholics believe in an uncreated being, that God is an uncreated being. He never had a beginning, never had an end. God exists outside of time and space, omniscient, all-knowing, all-powerful. And in the traditional perspectives, God is perfect, and so there is no need of change. Now, I meant to make this, there are folks who prefer a gender-neutral language for God, and it's one I understand, but it's kind of, ingrained to speak of God in a masculine tense, and so I tend to do that most spontaneously. In addition, for those of us who are Catholic, we share this idea of the notion of a Trinity, that there are three persons who share in this same divine nature, and that it makes clear for us the importance of a loving relationship and the importance of being in a community. Humans, by contrast, are created beings. We are limited in knowledge. We are limited to being in particular times and space. Right now, I'm in Washington, D.C. Ordinarily, I'm in Orem, Utah. I can't be in both places at the same time physically, but through the wonders of technology and electrons, I'm able to be there with you in Utah. But because of these limitations, we are limited in our ability to understand fully an infinite, unlimited, uncreated being. And so, like the blind man in the story about the elephant, we need to sample as many different sides of the elephant as we can to gain as deep an understanding of this infinite, uncreated being as we can at any given time. Always recognizing we're limited. We will never understand God and the infiniteness that God exists. So what I like to do, I'm a physical scientist. I like models. I love molecules. And so I offer for you this image of a multifaceted crystal. It's one I stole from my former pastor and employer and spiritual director, Father Dave Bittman. If you take a multifaceted crystal, and I have one here, but it's a little hard to see. I didn't bring my big one with me. And you rotate it in the light. As you rotate it about, each of the different facets reflect sometimes a different color of light. And so I use that image, and again, recognizing it's an analogy, and analogies are limited when we're talking about God, that we can imagine each of those different facets as representing something about God. And that by rotating through the sphere, getting all those facets, we can begin to accumulate different pictures, different characteristics, each of them representing some aspect of the divine. Okay, it's an analogy. It breaks down pretty quickly, but at least gives you a sense when I talk about the multiple dimensions and our understanding of the Godhead. So let me just briefly acknowledge the folks who have been involved in grinding my lenses in a Catholic tradition. I was fortunate enough to be able to receive a bachelor's up through my bachelor's degree in Catholic institutions. And my experience has been a little bit different, Heather. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, Fred Rogers neighborhood. Fred Rogers and my father lived in the same neighborhood. But my Catholic schools, my Catholic grade school, my Catholic high school, and I celebrated my 50th high school reunion this year. I don't think anybody ever got that old. But college, and it was classes I took at both a women's college and at a men's college. I had Catholic sisters, priests, and monks for whom faith and science went in hand in hand. And so I really didn't experience that kind of tension. We had discussions about evolution. We had discussions about Genesis. I was going through the period of time now, we now talk about as Vatican II in the church, where a lot of renewal, a lot of innovation was taking place. And so all those kinds of things were part of my education. I was also fortunate enough to be to grow up in a family. I had an uncle who was a seminarian at the time, Catholic seminary in Columbus, Ohio, who was studying to become a priest. And he introduced me to a Catholic paleontologist, anthropologist, who was the first to try to attempt to reconcile Darwin's evolution and his understanding not only of evolution, but plate tectonics and fossils and the geological formations, to put a Catholic spin on those, to try to reconcile those. He suffered greatly for making those efforts. He was banished to China by the Vatican and by his religious order. He was a Jesuit priest. But after his death, his writings were allowed to be published. And so he died in 1955. And by the time I was looking in 1970, 69, 70, 75, his work was beginning to be accepted. So that's the formation, to a great extent, of my Catholic lens. But then I served at Brigham Young University as a professor of chemistry, a Catholic professor of chemistry at BYU. And I had a real great blessing, an opportunity to teach a class called Physical Science 100. It was a required general education course for BYU undergrads. And a specific objective of this course was to discuss conflicts of faith and science to show where they arose and how they could be resolved. My tutor, in preparing for this class, because I had promised that, and I told the students this at the beginning of every semester, if you wanted the Catholic perspective on this stuff, you'd have gone to Notre Dame, but you've come to BYU, and so I have a responsibility to teach you BYU's perspective. So Jay Balloff was professor of physics, provost of the university, and was my tutor for several semesters or semester offerings as I was preparing to teach the class. Jay was the provost at the university, but he was a master teacher, and he was especially a master at sharing his faith in ways that was authentic and not contrived, and wasn't just like wearing his faith on his sleeve. And I found it to be a very helpful way of looking at things. As my bio has indicated, I've been married for 40 some years to Steve Goates, who is also a professor of chemistry. We met doing chemistry in Burlington, Vermont one summer. And so, yeah, the chemistry is right between us. Steve is a high priest in the LDS Church, has always been a member of the LDS Church. And those of you living in Utah, a 3-year engagement would probably surprise you as something that, like 3 months is a long time. So we spent a long time trying to figure out whether we could make this two-faith religion work. We did, but we never encouraged anybody to do it. Our son, we have 2 children. I'm with my daughter here in the DC area. And our son, JD-Goates, he's this guy here in the gray sweatshirt, was served as an LDS mission, a Spanish-speaking mission in the Bronx. And he got there about 3 days before Hurricane Sandy hit. And much of his time in the first couple of months were helping people, Staten Island, clean out their homes, not much to salvage. And so with both of them, Steve and JD, I've had lots of conversations, and especially because, as this little poster here in the side might suggest, JD came out to us as a gay young man during the summer between his junior and his senior year. And while he was on his LDS mission, he was very upfront with the mission president that he was gay, but that he had, he was going to abide by the commitments and the covenants that he had made. So it began an interest for me in the science that was associated, and it's, as we'll mention briefly, still emerging in terms of gay LGBTQ folks. Okay. So Heather has given you two of the most popular examples of the historical conflicts between people of faith and science. Galileo, who challenged the earth-centered image of creation that Pope Urban favored, and Darwin, who challenged the literal interpretations of the Genesis 1 and 2 creation stories. Now, a common approach to resolve such conflicts begins by putting the two domains, the two areas, the two domains, science and faith, into two different boxes. And the boxes are labeled: science answers the how questions, and faith answers the why questions. An example, the how question. This is my favorite, one of my favorite examples that I learned about when I was teaching a biophysical class to junior, senior biochemistry majors. So take a marshmallow, burn it in a campfire. You get this wonderful flame. What's happening is that the sugars in the marshmallow are igniting, and you get this nice heat, lots of heat that's getting off. But if you eat that marshmallow, your body does something different with that same energy that's embedded in that marshmallow, and it allows you to climb mountains. And in the case, as Heather's talked about, making new molecules that help us to fight the vaccines, the infections with antibodies. So those are what we mean by how questions. Faith questions would be one, like the question I learned to answer by memory, and I don't memorize much, but this is something I memorized in 4th grade. Why did God make me? God made me to know him, to love him, and to serve him in this world and the next. Well, that was the Baltimore Catechism, and we studied that in the early days of my Christian formation. The Baltimore Catechism, circa 1959-ish, based on doctrines that were established in the post-Reformation Catholic Church, the Council of Trent, circa 1570. Vatican II has changed some of that in terms of how we study our faith, but the how-why distinction still works for some people. But this approach provides for me a division that I find deeply unsatisfying. The Teilhard de Chardin, whom I mentioned briefly, believed that the universe would get more complex and diversified through evolution and through cosmogenesis. So cosmogenesis is the Big Bang, creation of fundamental particles, and then bigger and bigger and bigger up to galaxies and universes. That increasing complexity and diversity, though, would be matched by an increasing demand for unified perspective. So we would have unity within the diversity of all of those created beings. And so what that thinking has done is try to help me rephrase how we look at this conflict, and to ask things in two different kinds of questions. Can we take these apparent conflicts and see them as an invitation to revisit what we've believed for centuries? And that deals with what we've believed, meaning religion and faith for centuries. And can we work toward a mutually respectful dialogue between science and faith, between scientists and theologians, ministers, people of faith, just baptized people of faith, people who profess faith, in a way that would allow us to build on that dialogue and help us to understand something deeper about the nature of God. Keeping in mind, of course, we're always limited, but we can always add another little facet to what we understand. So that's the perspective that I'm going to try to finish the rest of what I'm going to say. So it turns out that what I'm proposing is really a kind of ressourcement, or returning to the sources, to our roots, because in the early times, both ancient, in the Hebraic tradition, the Jewish scripture, and in the early church, that was the perspective that we had. So if I look, for example, at scripture, Job, I could have a psalm passage. There are numerous passages, but let's just look at this passage of Job. Ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee. Speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee. Who knoweth not in all these that the hand of the Lord hath wrought this? So scripture and nature telling us, supporting this idea of a common creator, and that knowing something about the creation tells us something about the creator. Now, Irenaeus was an early church father, and Pope Francis is going to benight him as a doctor of the church, which establishes his authority. And so I'm happy to use his quote today. He was in the first 300 years of the church, so very early Christianity. For creation reveals him who formed it, and the very work made suggests him who made it, and the world manifests him who ordered it. So this unified perspective, as Bonaventure, a Franciscan in the 15th century, said, there were two books of Revelation. The first book of Revelation was nature, and the second book of Revelation was scripture. That idea persisted until the Enlightenment, until we started to have a development of scientific methods that gave rise to ways of looking at things that were the challenges to Urban's teaching perspective. And as I like to think about it, Pope Urban wanted to be able to tell God how he had done things. Unfortunately, Pope Urban wasn't God, and God found Galileo to be a better messenger for how he was doing things. And that's an important message for us to keep in mind. So I've already mentioned the idea of analogies, and that when we're talking about God, those analogies are incomplete. So theologians use analogies to describe God that are limited and flawed, but scientists use models to describe the natural world, and they are also limited and flawed. No scientist understands everything there is to know about all of the different ways of looking at science. I try, but it doesn't work. I don't have that many hours a day. So neither has all the answers, and what is really required is humility, and that we have to recognize on both sides that we're still working to understand. We still need more analogies, more models, and maybe working together, we can get a little further ahead. In view of our limited understanding at any point in time, it's probably not unreasonable to expect that as we gain new knowledge and newly discovered texts in scripture in the desert, or new experiments in the laboratory, new theories, new models, we should recognize that God, if we assume my starting point, that the study of nature tells us something about the nature of God, and we should recognize that God's continuously revealing himself to us. I have to be a little careful because the Catholic tradition is to talk about a closed canon. So we have scripture, and the way in which we describe it is that everything that we need for our salvation and for our future life has been revealed in the books of scripture, the Old Testament and the New Testament. But especially in the post-Vatican II, especially thanks to the Protestants, the development of different ways of reading scripture that take us beyond a literal interpretation. We've adapted that description to think about, we're not going to have any new revelations. We're not going to have a revelation that, hey, guess what? We were wrong. There are 4 people in the Trinity instead of 3. But what we will have is that God will reveal himself, God's self, to us in different ways. And so this quote from Romans, ever since the creation of the world, and certainly ongoing, my addition, his invisible attributes of power and divinity have been able to be understood and perceived in what he has made. So even in the time of Paul writing the letter to Romans. And so you might be asking yourself at this point, people of faith especially, why does the science matter? Well, Heather has given you one reason why science matters. Science had the potential in this time of pandemic to save lives. One can go through, Heather's done a good job of explaining why that doesn't work for some people. There are other, I think, things that are involved, but let me take it from a different perspective. Thomas Aquinas was a 13th century philosopher, theologian, Dominican priest, who wrote something about why science matters. Specifically in the Summa Contra Gentiles, he says the consideration of creatures is necessary, not only for the building up of truth, but also for the destruction of errors. Errors about creatures can lead us to inconsistency with true nature of knowledge of God. As my favorite Franciscan in the 21st century, Richard Rohr, likes to say, if we get the nature of creatures wrong, we get something wrong about the nature of God. And so there is a really important reason that faith and science should go hand in hand. Because if the faithful people have something wrong about the nature of science, or what science tells us about creation, creatures, chances are they're missing something really fundamental about the nature of God. Okay, what I want to do is to give you 2 examples that, for me, illustrate a fruitful dialogue that is possible between faith and science. I'm going to start with that conflict with Genesis that Heather alluded to. It seems to me that it should have been apparent that if you read the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 have 2 different accounts of creation that are not internally consistent. And so that should have been, it seems to me, an understanding that they were not meant to be taken literally. Otherwise, it would be like, well, which one do you privilege? Which one is the closer to the truth about how God really did it? Well, the reality is maybe that was not their important message. And then when evolution and cosmology came along, remember, cosmology has to do with the creation of the universe, from the Big Bang to small particles to big particles to us. It seems as though it shouldn't have been that big a deal, because we'd have already reconciled that Genesis was about something else. Well, what was it about? One perspective now is that Genesis is really about telling us the relationship between the creator and the creation. First point, God alone is the creator. Second point, everything is God's creation. We didn't have a hand in, we might make new molecules, but God is underlying the fundamental laws that govern those. Everything which God creates is good. Genesis 1, the 6 days of creation, and God looks at it, finds it to be good. And the final point is one for the scientists, is that we have that responsibility to treat creation as being good, not something that we can irresponsibly use up and throw away. And so there's a fundamental relationship for us there. Okay. The second example that I want to talk about has to do with understanding something about the nature of God. So the Western tradition, so Roman Catholicism and the faith that grew out of the Catholic Church in the post schismatic years and the post-Reformation years bear an influence of the Greeks. And so how we think about God has a Greek stamp on it. For the Greeks, and I should use a lowercase God there, lowercase g, God was about order and perfection. And in times of chaos and wars, and you can understand why you would structure your belief in a God that was about order and perfection. But it led to this idea that God works through orderly and predictable processes. So order is perfection, therefore God is ordered. No. Unfortunately for the Greeks and for some of us who, as Heather pointed out, want things to be unchanging, that's not what more modern science has helped us to understand. So if we look at the science of evolution and cosmology, they are based upon random events occurring. Some cell mutates and produces a new kind of life form. In cosmology, there are random fluctuations in matter out in space that cause gravitational collapses, and those collapses bring particles together, and you form from fundamental particles, you form a more complex one. And the laws of force, electromagnetism, and force laws all are predictable laws, but they require that random event of enough matter getting together to kick the thing off, or something, some unstructure, some problem, maybe a photon coming through and zapping that DNA when it's in the process of reproducing itself. So we have random events that occur within a lot of predictable ones, and these random processes lead to increasing order and complexity, following the orderly laws that I'm going to say God put in place back at the time of the Big Bang. Okay, so if I'm beginning to sound like a creationist, no, but I can understand where the appeal of that comes from for some people. And then in the 20th century, quantum mechanics, the physics that was beginning with Albert Einstein and Heisenberg and some of those Schrodinger guys. This is the Schrodinger equation down here. It introduces this idea of what's called a wave equation, that anything that can be known about something is built into that wave equation. But wave equations are not the best way of describing particles or things like human beings. But the key part of it is that it introduces a certain unpredictability. Well, it tells us that there's a certain unpredictability that is built into the basic fabric of the universe, that inherent openness to random fluctuations in material systems. One of my favorite astronomers is a Jesuit brother, Guy Consolmagno, PhD in astronomy from MIT. And he likes to talk about God using these fluctuations, this uncertainty, to work miracles. That's a topic for another day. I'd love to, I don't want to take too much time to go there. But the key work for us, the key idea and image for us is that the gears of life, the gears of the universe work smoothly, how gears work, with the idea that God is perfect, but he works through chaos. Now, that's led some people to predict or to suggest that perhaps God is unchanging. If God's creation is constantly reinventing itself and changing, perhaps God is changing. Haven't worked my way through that one yet. But let me represent our understanding of the nature of God and how it expands through dialogue in the way that the tendrils of a vine, growing plant like grapes or morning glories, when they first start, they're very tiny, but then as they get longer and longer, they expand to allow the newly forming shoots, the ones up here at the top, to have access to the sun, so that they're more able to capture the sun energy. And I like to, this analogy of there's a dialogue of faith meeting a dialogue of science. And if it's mutual as opposed to button heads and, telling each other, anathema sit, you're condemned, that discussion moves up a little bit, and it moves up a little bit, and it expands, allowing us to gain new insights into the nature of God. And this example that I want to use is this idea, the nature of God is that God works through chaos. The Greek idea of perfection is something we gotta, put by the wayside. It's not an accurate way of describing it. Okay, so the next topic that I think science and faith ought to undergo in this kind of mutually respectful dialogue would have to do with issues of gender identity and sexual orientation. Several summers ago, the Congregation for the Catholic Education, a Vatican congregation, published, it's one of congregations, one of their big offices, Catholic Education, male and female, he created them toward a path of dialogue on the question of gender theory in education. Now, anyone who read it with any experience in gender ideology or family members, as I, or in my pastoral ministry, or even at my years at BYU, had people come to me as a safe person experiencing gender ideology, will recognize that what was written in that document doesn't adequately represent a dialogue with the science. By this corner over here is Jeffrey Holland. Elder Jeffrey Holland is one of the apostles of the LDS Church. He happened to be the president of BYU who hired me. And so I have known, I still have a hard time not thinking of him as Elder, I think of him as Jeff, because that's how I met him. I met Jeff and Pat in a party in their backyard of their house on campus. And to this day, he still remembers me. I mean, he's that kind of a person. But 2 weeks ago, beginning of the semester, longer than that, I guess, he gave a talk that was very hurtful for people who are LGBT community members, but also very hurtful for faculty members who feel that they are called to be safe spaces for their students, for their staff members. And so what I'm hoping is that the science is still out. I posted something on Catholic Twitter the other day, and it's basically I thought was posted something that was established science, but holy moly, was I wrong about that. So I've got a lot of work to do in terms of understanding where some people think the science is. But my message is to people of faith: don't shut a door that future developments may force you to reopen. It's a joke among Catholic theologians that the church has a tendency of saying no, 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 and then the overwhelming evidence becomes overwhelming, and then they think, as we have always taught. And that's, for those of us who followed that path, that's not a very faith-fulfilling path. And so my encouragement to people of faith is to engage, as Heather has suggested, with scientists, but also to be willing to rethink how they think about our place in the universe. So Teilhard Chardin, third time I've mentioned him, died on Easter Sunday, 1955. About a year and a month after I was born. And in a small publication called Toward the Future, he wrote this: "The day will come when, after harnessing space, the winds, the tides, and gravitation, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And on that day, for the second time in the history of the world, humankind will have discovered fire." Now, as evidence of my optimism that this unity, this unifying within diversity can happen, I show Elder Jeffrey Holland, speaking a few weeks ago in General Conference, quoted these words in gold from Teilhard Chardin. "And on that day, for the second time, humankind will have discovered fire." Now, even when I knew Jeff back in 1982, I'd have never expected him to quote Teilhard Chardin. And so when my husband calls me and says, "Julie, I think Elder Holland just quoted Teilhard Chardin," it was like, really? Wonderful. Okay. Well, let me end with something I learned when I was in grade school. AMDG, it's one of the Latin phrases that the Jesuits used. Jesuits being Teilhard, Pope Francis, ad majorem Dei gloriam, all for the honor and glory of God. And with that, the end. Amen. Thank you.
Julie, thank you so much for this very informative presentation. I want to go ahead and ask participants if you have any questions for our speakers. Please unmute yourself if you have any question, or you can put your question in the chat. Okay. Right, it's like we don't have any question. I just want to add,
I
somebody.
think both Neil and James want to speak.
Yeah, and James has. Yeah, James
Okay,
has-
I don't see on my end. Sorry about that. Neil, please go ahead.
For both speakers, I like to ask the question, are you optimistic for the future?
Go ahead, Heather.
Sorry, technical difficulties here. Yes, I just by virtue of the fact I'm still here, I still get up every morning. I still feel like there's got to be somewhere I can make a difference. And yeah, I hope today was one of those days. As far as where we're headed, don't write us off yet. We've been here a long time. We'll figure it out. We've had darker days. Then I think we need to look to each other as a way to get through these times. We've done it to some extent. We just need to pull that extra few feet to the finish line and make it work as a people, as a human race.
Well, as a Catholic, of course, I distinguish between hope and optimism. And so I'm not very optimistic for the next short period of time, but my hope, of course, is that in the end, the resurrection will triumph and will be the way we're meant to be. But I do have to tell you that I was enormously heartened, as I just mentioned, that Jeff Holland quoted a Catholic paleontologist, because the Twitter went over, the people were, what did he say? Who's this guy he's talking to? And the whole discussion began about who is this Teilhard de Chardin and why is Elder Holland quoting him? So it gives me hope in the long run that, and it may be that, evolution's going to have to take care of some of this contrariness that we have, but that we will begin to get along in a better way. Now, the pandemic has made me doubt that, but we're only seeing a small slice of history right now.
Thank you.
My name is Neil. I have a question for both of you. I enjoyed the talk from each one of you. Both of you happen to were trained in chemistry, and it was easy for you to appreciate what you talk about, the basis of evolution and other parts of thinking. What about the scientists who are called political scientists? And they're also called scientists. What about economics economists, and those who do not have background like you two have. And what do they think about faith and science?
Well, most of the political scientists and economists that I know are people that I encountered during my 30-some years at BYU. I worked in the Office of General Education and Honors. I was Associate Dean and encountered a lot of political scientists. One of my best friends is a political scientist in Far Eastern, in Eastern studies, in Muslim studies. And to a person, they accept evolution, they accept quantum mechanics, they may not understand the mathematical equations, but they understand the uncertainty principle in a general way. I suspect there are people I didn't encounter at BYU who exist that way. I know that's the case, and I think certainly Brittany probably encountered, Heather, I'm sorry, probably encountered them in her experiences at these other, other institutions. I think I was lucky.
Okay.
Heather, would you like to add anything?
I had a few thoughts and they just evaporated. I think like Julie said, I have encountered those people. What I've found happens most often is, as long as it doesn't affect their lives directly, they're okay to let it be. Sure, quantum mechanics can go exist over here, or Darwin's theory is fine, as long as it doesn't impact directly on my life. Sure, it's great. Progress, yay team, go. But yeah, I found increasingly when people felt that it impacted on their beliefs or their vision of themselves in the world, that's when things got real. The fists came out. So. And that's a hard time to meet people when they feel picked on or singled out. So that's my experience.
Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. We will get one last question from Ellie, and we are going to conclude our session. Ellie.
It's not from me. Hang on, it's from one of my students.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Taylor. It's nice to meet you guys. I just had a question for Julie. So I'm transgender. I want to preface it with that. And I really liked what you said about introducing the gender identity piece and sexual orientation piece and talking about the LGBT community. In your perspective, what do you think, how do you think adaptability and everything in religion can help, like, how do you think, sorry, let me rephrase that. How do you think it will help? Like, how do you think religion can evolve to be more inclusive, and what gives you hope for that?
In the slide in which I introduced that topic, there was a picture of a book called Building Bridges by a Jesuit priest. I guess the Jesuit priests are my favorite kind of priest right now because they're open to a lot of new ideas. And James Martin lives in New York City, and he has written quite a lot, but this particular book is about building bridges between members of the LGBT community by welcoming them. All too often in Catholic parishes, the priest stands up and gives a homily and badmouths and just says things that are hurtful and in some cases not accurate, either from science or from a faith perspective. And what Martin is saying is to build bridges. Pope Francis, on one of his famous airplane talks, as he's interviewed by the press as he's flying to or from Rome after a trip, an international trip, talked about meeting a gay person, and I don't remember now at the moment whether the person was LGBTQ, gay or transgender. But he quoted a Viennese cardinal who talked about meeting people for the first time and getting to experience them as humans. And for me, that's what needs to happen. So I had an opportunity when I was a pastoral minister at St. Francis to work with a group of young people. And there was a young woman, as she presented herself then, who just seemed always to be unhappy. Not angrily unhappy, but sad unhappy. She and her family had moved from the Midwest, and for a while I thought, maybe that was the case. And then after she got confirmation, she was being in classes to be confirmed. That was why I knew her. She came back, and her mom wrote me that Alex was transitioning to be male, and went through a number of the surgeries, top surgery, and some of the transitioning treatments. And I had an opportunity to go to Alex's high school graduation. If people who doubt the reality of the sense of being in the wrong body need to experience someone in a before and after transition. That young person was open and buoyant and outgoing and doing all kinds of things that young person's parents have had to push. Go do this. You need to be with other people your age. And that for me is what it's going to take. It's going to take each of us. And so in some ways I have more hope for the LDS authorities because they have someone who can say, Grandpa, I'm gay. And Grandpa is a member, is in the first presidency, or Grandpa is an elder, is a bishop. Having celibate, unmarried, for the most part, priests means it has to come, but Uncle Dave, I'm gay. Will you still love me? That's what it's going to take for people to realize that the ones they love are the people they're wanting to hang out to dry. You're muted.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Julie and Heather. Your presentations made us hopeful for our future. And one takeaway for me from this presentation, God created faith and God created science. God created each of us. And there is no way that there should be conflict among them. So we each, science and faith, supports each other to understand God better. As long as we don't have biases toward anything, we are going to be agree with science and faith. And I'm hoping we are going to have more. We are going to create understanding and awareness on science and faith together as we work together. Okay, I want to thank you, each of you. Thank you so much. I appreciate for your time, and we over our time, but I just want to ask one more question. If you have any announcements, please make your announcements and limit with 30 seconds, please. And Ellie, yeah, go ahead, please.
Author coming to town, and it's Dr. Craig Considine. Thank you. He's the author of a book called People of the Book, and it's about Prophet Muhammad's encounter with the Christian communities during their time in the early development of Islam and the beginnings of the Prophet Muhammad's life. There is a huge long list of events. We're dragging that man through like 12-hour day, starting at 9:30 in the morning at BYU, 12:30 here at UVU, 6 p.m. at the First Baptist Church, and then 8 p.m. at the Islamic Center on 9000 South. You should have all received an email with the flyer and all the different locations and the details. The events on the campuses will be very dialogue oriented. The event that I just like to spotlight for you is the one at 6 p.m. at the First Baptist Church on 13th East and Salt Lake City, which will be a panel moderated by myself and a scholar from BYU, a woman leader from a local Islamic organization called Emerald Project, not Emerald Hills, a different Emerald, and the author. So please take a look at your email. You should have that flyer there. If you don't, reach out to us. We'd love to see you at any or all of those events.
Thank you, Ali. Any other announcements? I'm not seeing everyone on my end. Please just jump in if you have an announcement. Okay. All right then. Thank you so much everyone for joining us. Next meeting will be at the Juan Diego High School next month, and you will be receiving emails regarding that. If you are not a member yet, please consider being a member so that you can get inclusive invitation, more specific invitations, as well as our regular invitations. And we want to see you next time, and we like your support. We can't do anything without you. Thank you so much being here today. Have a wonderful day.
Bye, Zainab.
See you. Bye-bye. Linda, it was very nice to see you.
It was awesome to